If I was to give this morning's message a title, it would be entitled Regaining a Sense of Security. I love Psalm 4, verse 8, where David says, I will both lie down and be at peace and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me to dwell in safety. What I want to get across this morning is that security is not the absence of danger. Security is the presence of God. This week, as we watched with horror and anger at the events of Charlie Kirk's murder and assassination, I was struck by the words of a law enforcement expert who was being interviewed on national news, and he said this, and it struck a chord with me. Charlie's death brings with it a sense of vulnerability. And so it does. Mark just talked about it. That's right. These things unnerve us. We wonder what's next. We wonder who's next. The death and killing of Charlie Kirk assaulted our sense of security. Charlie Kirk's death brings with it a sense of vulnerability. This is an evil day. The question is, will we stand fearless in an evil day? Charlie Kirk said he wanted to be remembered for having a courageous faith. Here was a man who would rather die on his feet than live on his knees. And that's challenging. And so for a few moments, I want to stir us up. I want to remind us that the security is not the absence of danger, it's the presence of God. I want to help us regain our sense of security. I want to remind us that with God, we can dwell in safety. For a few minutes, I want to reflect on my time in the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. I was a police officer in Northern Ireland between 1982 and 1988. Northern Ireland was in conflict. On several occasions, it came on the verge and borders of civil war. Our country was being assaulted by a socialist, Marxist, terrorist group called the IRA. They wanted to sever Northern Ireland from the United Kingdom, wanted to undermine the democratic will of the people of Northern Ireland. And I felt a call to duty, and so I joined the RUC as a part-time officer. I was an engineer by day, I was an officer by night, or on the weekends whenever they needed us. At its height, the RUC comprised of about 14,500 men and women, both full-time and part-time. I was part-time. 333 officers were killed across the span of the Troubles. I have a poster in my office at the church with every picture of those fallen officers on it, because we will not forget. 9,000 officers were injured in some capacity during the conflict. In 1983, Interpol said that policing in Northern Ireland was second only to El Salvador in terms of danger. And yet in the middle of all of that, when there was no peace in Northern Ireland, God gave me a peace. I love Isaiah 26, verse 3. I will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind and heart is stayed on me. John 14:27, Jesus promised his followers, my peace I give unto you, not as the world gives, give I unto you. This was a peace that was a gift from God. This was a divine peace. This was a peace, to borrow the words of Paul in Philippians, that passed all understanding, was beyond human comprehension. It was a peace that I enjoyed, although it was a peace hard won. And what I want to do is share three thoughts that I shared actually on Thursday at a business breakfast in Ontario, the day after Charlie's death. And I shared three lessons that I learned and worked through as a police officer in Northern Ireland. The things that God taught me about death, about evil men, and about where security is truly found. Now, let me give you the first lesson. I talk about this in my book, Take Cover. Number one, I learned to use the constant threat of death as a motivation to live wisely and well. It was something I wrestled with. I was in my early 20s. For a time in the police, I wasn't married, and then for a time in the police, I was married. Those were heavy thoughts to wrestle with one's own mortality and one's own demise. I lived for 6 years with no sense of security in a human way. We were more likely to be killed off duty than on duty. During my time in North Belfast, our station was rocketed with RPG rockets. A couple of our officers were shot. One of our sergeants was killed dead coming into the station by an IRA killer. The IRA presented a clear and present danger. Officers were killed at home, shopping, going to church. They were blown up in their car. One of the favorite weapons of the IRA was an undercar booby trap, a cassette case, a pound of Semtex explosives, a mercury tilt switch, and they would come during the night and they would put it onto your car. That's why every morning, both when I was in the police and after I left the police, because they also killed you after you left the police, I would check under my car for one of those booby traps. The threat was real. The threat was constant. It was never ending. I remember being on a weekend training with the RUC along with the British Army, and we were showing a video of all the latest techniques and weapons the IRA may employ. We were given case studies of officers that had been shot. The video was entitled, "You Could Be Next," because it was real. And so the thought of death encroached on my life. It was a suffocating thing at times. But by the grace of God, I learned to embrace it. I learned to face it. And I learned to let it motivate me to live a wise life and a good life. A life dedicated to Jesus Christ. A life that would glorify God. Because as an officer in Northern Ireland at that time, there was a pronounced sense of mortality. And God ministered to me through several verses. I'll give you them. Psalm 90, verse 12. Number your days and apply your heart unto wisdom. My circumstances preach that. Psalm 39, verse 4 tells you to consider your latter end and the measure of your days and remember that you're frail. The passage that maybe challenged me most and ministered to me most would be Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes 7, especially verses 2 to 4. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fool is in the house of mirth. In his book on Ecclesiastes, David Gibson talks about living life backwards. That's the thesis of his book. He believes that's the theme of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes confronts us with the brutality of life, the futility of life, the inexplicable events of life, the unbending reality of death. And Ecclesiastes challenges us to live life aware of that. Not to run from it, not to deny it, but to understand this is the end of all men and the wise take it to heart. And so therefore live backwards, not forwards. See your life in every day you live, in every word you say, in every action you do, in everything you confront, in every suffering you go through in the light of your death. See it from an eternal perspective. Solomon lived backwards. Better to go to the house of mourning. Moses lived backwards. Number your days and apply your heart unto wisdom. Jesus lived backwards. In John 9, verse 4, he says, you know what? There's coming a day when no man shall work. But my Father works and I work. When you get to John 17, he says, the work that you gave me to do, Father, I finished. Jesus lived backwards. And these verses remind us that death, ironically, can be a tonic for life. It can cause us to prize it more. It challenges us to live more and love more. It challenges us to redeem the time. I like what David Gibson says in his book. Your life won't go on forever, but death is not just a line you cross when your time is up. Death is an evangelist. He looks us in the eye and asks us to look him right back in the face, allowing him to do his work. Death is a preacher with a very simple message. Death is an invitation to us. He wants to teach us that the day of our coming death can be a friend to us in advance. The very limitation that death introduces into our life can instruct us about life. Think of it as death's helping hand. And I embrace that. As Mark said, we're all going to die, and I was going to die. I focused on the fact that it might be by an IRA bullet or an IRA bomb, but that was just one way I could die. But it was pronounced, it was real, and it kind of was suffocating, and so it made me, as a young man in my 20s, maybe face death in ways that others haven't. But I let it become an evangelist. I looked it straight in the face and I had to come up with an answer. And I found that answer in Jesus Christ. I found that answer in the gospel. I found that answer in the promise that though you die, yet shall you live, because I'm the resurrection and the life. If you read Ecclesiastes 7, death is better than life, fasting is better than feasting, sorrow is better than laughter. See, when you go to the house of mourning, you're reminded of how short your life is, how intrusive it can be, and it raises questions. Are you living for those things that death, money cannot buy and death cannot steal? Have you allowed the world to switch the price tags on your life? Why are we so obstinate and arrogant when we're arguing with our spouses or we're angry with our children? What is that in the light of eternity? All of those kind of things are good. Death is a minister. Death is a friend. Death is a helping hand. I don't know if you know the story behind the Nobel Peace Prize. You've heard of it, right? The Nobel Peace Prize. Some say our president may even be running for it. But here's the story behind it. There was a man called Alfred Nobel. He was a Swedish scientist, and one of his inventions was dynamite, which wreaked havoc all around the world, for the most part. A reporter heard of the death of an Alfred Nobel, and that's not our Alfred Nobel. But eager for getting a story, this reporter ran with it. He got ahead of the wrong story, and he published the news that Alfred Nobel was dead, although he is very much alive. It was another Alfred Nobel, but here was the headlines that were splashed across the wires in the newspapers. Alfred Nobel dead. Dynamite king dies. The merchant of death is gone. The inventor of destruction is no more. On the one hand, Alfred Nobel was angry when he heard about this. But then it also was very sobering to think about how he would be remembered in the light of his death. And so he started living backwards. And he reoriented his life, and he started the Nobel Peace Prize. He set out to expunge the idea that he was the merchant of death. He wanted to be a man known for peace. And death can do that. When we live backwards, when we see ourselves, think about that moment. Is the life you're living how you want to go into the presence of God? Is your attitudes and actions and spending and friendships and pursuits the kind of thing that will give you a happy death? See, meditation upon one's death is good for us. It teaches us to treasure time. It prioritizes relationships. It helps us to hold material things lightly. It makes us more grateful for the moment we're living. It helps us keep short accounts with God. And it causes us to greatly rejoice in the message of the gospel that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And that according to 2 Timothy 1 verse 10, that Jesus Christ came and abolished death and brought light and immortality through the gospel. One of the things I saw as a police officer in Northern Ireland was the work of the ATO officers of the British Army. Sometimes we'd be called to a bomb scare, and it would be our job to cordon off an area, put a perimeter. We would stay away from the bomb like we wanted everybody else to stay away from the bomb. But some brave soul, one man called an Army technical officer, would put on protective gear, a helmet, and he would take what was known as, quote, the long walk towards the car, towards the bomb. Sometimes it was a hoax, many times it wasn't. Some of those men lost their lives in heroic fashion for the good of society and the protection of our people. Many times they disarmed the bomb and saved lives, and life went back to some normalcy. As a police officer, I reminded myself often that death is a ticking bomb. It's a frightening prospect, isn't it? Hebrews 2. It's the terror of kings and the king of terrors, and men are held bondage by it. But you know how I broke free from that bondage? Because Jesus Christ took the long walk to Calvary, and he diffused death in his resurrection. And whether the IRA killed me or cancer killed me or old age got me, though I die, yet shall I live. There's an old Irish expression, live today as if it were your last, because someday it will be. Meditate on your death. Let death become an evangelist so that we might live more fully. Here's my second lesson. I learned to leave the final act of justice and judgment to God. Every police officer and every soldier in Northern Ireland struggled with this, because not every murder was solved. Not every bomber was caught. The widow's tears were never ever wiped away with some sense of justice. And that was hard. It was hard to walk the streets of North Belfast and know who some of the gunmen were, but we didn't have the goods on them. They intimidated witnesses. They rained terror over their communities. That's hard to deal with. It's hard to live with justice not being served. Crimes going unpunished, murderers going free, bad guys going unpunished. That's tough. During those days, it seemed as if truth was on the scaffold and evil was on the throne. And then we had the stomach, the apologists for the IRA, men like Jerry Adams and Sinn Féin, who would try and justify the mayhem and the murder. That was tough. And I struggled with it. I had a struggle of faith. Is God absent? Will justice ever be served? Will the widows be forgotten? And I was helped greatly by a couple of Psalms, Psalm 37 and Psalm 73. They were my go-to places. Psalm 37 says this, do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity, for they will soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Psalm 73, the psalmist is struggling as he looks out his window and the wicked are prospering. It's that age-old question of the prosperity of the wicked. and the suffering of the righteous. And the psalmist looks out, and the wicked of his society are strutting down the street without a care in the world. They seem to be beyond the reach of justice. They wear their arrogance like a medal around their neck. And in some areas of society, they're seen as heroic. Does that not sound like modern America? Life today? And the psalmist struggled with it. He says here, but as for me, my feet almost stumbled, my steps nearly slipped, and I was envious of the boastful. Kind of, if you can't beat them, I'm thinking about joining them. In fact, later on in the psalm, he says, what's the point of washing your hands, living a righteous life and staying clean? It doesn't pay. It isn't rewarded. It isn't seen as good in society. No, I'm in a society where good is evil and evil is good. And I'm struggling with it. In fact, he tells us later on, when I thought how to understand this, it was too painful. It's been a painful week, hasn't it? We're only experiencing what many of God's saints have experienced. But here's the turning point. Here's what Warren Wiersbe says. There came a point where he stopped being a philosopher and started being a worshiper. He says here, until I went into the sanctuary of God. I stopped worrying and started worshiping. I got my eyes off men. I stopped listening to the news. I started reading theology. I started reminding myself of doctrinal facts made warm by the Holy Spirit within my heart. And I looked to the throne of God, a higher throne. And you know what? I was reminded their end isn't pretty. Their life might seem like a dream right now, and I may be tempted to join the seeming dream, but the dream becomes a nightmare when God awakes in wrath. When God comes at the end of history and he balances the scales and he rights the wrongs. That's where the psalmist found his hope. And that was a go-to place for me. These scriptures promise that God will awake in judgment against the wicked. The end of the wicked is horrible. Their punishment is sure. And the Bible will show us in Revelation 20 to 22, we come out on top. What does the book of Revelation teach us? In the end, we win. But remember, it's at the end we win. In this world, you'll have tribulation. Through much tribulation, you'll enter the kingdom. That's the reality. And Psalm 73 and Psalm 35 tells us to be patient. God's justice may grind slowly, but it will grind exceedingly small. And although man may escape human justice and never see a day in court, that's not true in the end. They will fall into the hands of a living God, which is a fearful thing. That's what we need to remind ourselves about. 2 Thessalonians 1, 3 to 10, God's going to trouble someday those who trouble us. And you got to wait for that. And that's not easy. In fact, one day after another killing and another bombing, I clipped a poem out of a newspaper in Northern Ireland that has helped me. Or at least expressed my heart at times. Murders, murders, murders. Sometimes 3 a day, a bomb in a car, a shot in the head. They'll always find a way to leave some children fatherless, a widow half dead with grief. How can they do it? I wonder. It's beyond belief. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. I've prayed and prayed for what? I ask myself again as 2 more innocent men are shot. Funerals, 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 sometimes 3 a day, winding through the country roads, passing along the way, all the well-worn paths and beloved places, the home, the fields, the stream, where only a few short days ago these young men would walk and dream. They dreamed of a life before them, of sports and adventure and love, of families and friends around them. Oh God in heaven above, is this the life You plan for them. Why, oh why, their loved ones cry? Are evil men allowed to live when good men have to die? That was Northern Ireland. When I was in the police and beyond, it's the day we're living in. It's what we experienced this week with the brutal and wicked killing of Charlie Kirk. And you and I have got to deal with feelings of anger and bitterness and even a temptation to take the law into our own hands. Where's that sense of justice we cry? How is that? How is it that the dope dealer, the gang leader, the terrorist mastermind never seems to suffer? How is it that the abuser lives life unmolested? How is it that the merchants of death do not fear for their own lives? How is it that God seems to ignore those who ignore him? And that's not true. In small ways, in micro ways, and in pronounced ways, people's sins are finding them out. We don't always find that out, but their sins find them out. But in a long view of things, we are reminded to keep our eyes on the Lord, to remember that this is not an abandoned world, to remember their end. I struggled with this until I went into the sanctuary of God and I saw let's remember their end. Wicked people go to hell. Unrepentant people go to hell. Sinners go to hell. Justice will be served. We need to remember their end, remember our end. It's suffering and in its glory. It's heartache and in its peace. That's what Revelation 21 to 22 tell us. So it will be worth it when we're counted among the righteous. We're not washing our hands in vain. We're not living an empty experience. Let's not be lawless. Let's not give in to despair. Let's not become bitter. Let's keep our faith in God and keep our eyes on the end. You know, the IRA sympathizers in Northern Ireland used to speak to us in Gaelic. Some of the officers knew Gaelic, I didn't. But if they wanted to annoy us or speak to us, they'd often use a phrase called Chucky our la, our day will come. We're going to get the British Isle of Ireland. Well, they haven't yet. And they won't. Because of the resolve of our people. But if I move it into a spiritual realm, beyond a political realm, I used to say in my mind, but you forget something, our day will come as Christians. Our day will come as righteous men and women when God will vindicate his people. And God will balance the scales and God will visit horrifying judgment on the wicked. That's what we've got to keep our eyes on. In fact, when I studied Psalm 73 with you some time ago, I took a thought from an Australian pastor, Ray Gallia, I think his name was. And he says that the trouble with us is when it comes to injury and injustice and hurt, we tend to look at that as a photograph. We tend to freeze frame that injury, that violence, that crime. And we tend to focus there. And that's when we get sour, and we get angry, and we get bitter, and we become unspiritual. We lose our perspective, get our eyes off God. We take things into our own hands. We look to politicians for some solution. No, he says you need to see that not as a photograph and freeze it, but to see it as a frame in an unfolding movie. There is an end. That's just a moment in the movie. You got to get to the end of the movie. And then I saw their latter end. They're punished. They don't prosper. We prosper. And righteousness is rewarded. And it's just a good word. There's a difference between a picture and a movie. And it would be easy for us to focus on Wednesday and the tragedy that unfolded, or any event in our nation's life, or your own personal experience, but you've got to let the movie unfold. It's all unfolding to a script. And there is a determined end. There's not an alternative ending. There's just a one ending. The righteous reign and the wicked are punished. I've told you before, June doesn't mind me telling you this, when we watch a movie, which we like to do as a means of resting, sometimes about 8:30 at night after a long day, we'll pick something. And June's not good with, thrillers or mysteries. We're 5 minutes into the movie. I mean, basically, you've just had, the introduction, the music has stopped, and she'll go, "What's this movie about?" And I go, let's see what happens. 10 minutes in, what's his role? I don't understand. Who's he and what's his role? This point, I'm like grabbing a pillow and about to... And it's like, calm down. We're going somewhere. There's a movie director. There's a script. There's plot lines. That's the enjoyment of a movie. And hopefully in this movie, like all the movies we like to watch, a good Hollywood movie, it ends right with the good guys on top and the bad guys on the bottom. She was so bad in one movie. It was the movie Argo, which is Ben Affleck. It's about getting our hostages out of Iran. And there comes this tense moment, about 2/3 through the movie. And they're at the airport in Tehran, and they're trying to get out. And you're sitting on the edge of their seat, and you're wondering if they're going to make it. And at this point in the movie, the movie goes to Arabic, and there's no subtitles. And June turns to me and goes, "What are they saying?" I go, "How would I know? It's Arabic, I'm an Irishman. I have trouble with English, Arabic. But all jokes aside, you know what? But the joke's on me. I don't do that with movies, but sometimes I do it with life. The joke's on you. It's not just June. We're all impatient. We all want some resolution 15 minutes into the movie. But that's not the way it works. We got to keep our eyes on God. We got to see their latter end and our latter end, and there is a happy ever after moment. And in that, we find our peace and a sense of security. Finally, I learned that true security is not found in the absence of danger, but in the presence of God. Given the daily threat of assassination, you can imagine I took my personal security seriously. I carried a weapon with me 24/7. When I went to work during the day, I had it on me. When I preached as a lay Baptist pastor, I had it on me in the pulpit. I checked my car, as I said, every morning. I watched where I drove. June and I watched what we said in the company of people we didn't know. Who knows if your neighbor was an IRA sympathizer? And so I wasn't careless. I believed that trust in God doesn't make you irresponsible. God's sovereignty doesn't deny human responsibility. Nehemiah 4:9 says about the threat that Israel faced in the rebuilding of the city. It says that we prayed to God and we posted watchmen on the wall. Oliver Cromwell said to his parliamentary army, "Trust God and keep your powder dry." I did that. I trusted my training. I used my common sense. But I was always aware of my vulnerability. I always had a nagging feeling of insecurity. I was living life looking over my shoulder, wondering if death was a footstep behind me. Because remember, the terrorist always had the element of surprise. A well-executed attack would result in your death. Remember one weekend we were again doing some training with the British Army in Hollywood in Northern Ireland. It was the base of the British Paratroop Regiment in Northern Ireland. We did some work, and then after it, here's how the instructor finished. He said, "This will only help if they make a mistake." Wow. Thank you for that word. I needed that. But it's true. If they did it right, and they planned it accordingly, you were dead. Okay, I take my security seriously. I fulfill my responsibilities. But ultimately, you know what? I had to find security somewhere else, and that was in the sovereignty of God. That was in the presence of Jesus in my life through the Holy Spirit. That was in the promise that he'll never leave me or forsake me, or the truth that nothing will separate me from his love. Yeah, the IRA may be the means of my death, but God is the manager of my death. 2 Timothy 1 verse 7 tells us God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love and power and a sound mind. It is said that there are 365 fear nots in the Bible, one for every day. God doesn't want us being fearful. And security is not the absence of danger. It's the presence of God, which is ours to enjoy through the gospel, which is ours through a relationship with Jesus Christ. And knowing his love makes us more than conquerors, makes us brave, makes us courageous. See, security is not the absence of danger. You know, with every assassination, with every event, we're always trying to eliminate danger. And there's a place for that. But can we get rid of the fallacy that you can get to a place of 100% security? You can't. You've got to live bravely. Because security is not the absence of danger, it's the presence of God. You can try and outrun danger, but you can't. David thought about it in Psalm 55. He talks about, oh, that I had the wings of a dove, that I might fly away and be at rest. Isn't that a beautiful thought? I want to escape danger. I want to escape these people who are making my life a misery. Psalm 55 is a psalm on people's betrayal on David, both personally and politically, and the fact that his life was in danger. But it's a foolish notion. Some people try to outrun danger physically, geographically. They try to find a neighborhood, a place, a zip code where danger is removed. Good luck. Some people try to run emotionally. And so rather than facing problems or facing the moment they're in, they just retreat emotionally. They're there, but they're not there. They're emotionally cold and absent. And their eyes are an empty window. And then there are those who try to run chemically, alcohol, drugs. The RUC had some of the highest alcohol rates among police forces in Europe. That's the way our officers dealt in many ways with the danger. They ran chemically. Others ran physically, others ran emotionally. But you can run, but you can't hide from danger. It's a wicked world. And death is coming for all of us. And that's why David, later on in the psalm, says, you know what I learned? I learned to cast my burden on the Lord and know that he will sustain me. Did you notice that? God didn't remove his burden. God didn't remove the threat. God didn't remove his enemies. God sustained him in the presence of his enemies and in the face of his threats. You see, life is not about delivering ourselves from evil, but allowing God to deliver us and sustain us in the midst of evil. God did not deliver Daniel from the lion's den, but sustained him in it. God did not deliver Daniel's friends from the fiery furnace, but sustained them in it. God did not deliver David from the valley of the shadow of death, but delivered and sustained him in it. God did not deliver his son from the cross, but sustained him for it. And that's the secret. That's what helped me. My protection was not my body armor. It was not my 9mm Walther pistol. It was not my machine gun. It was not the armored cars. Although I didn't discount those, if you've heard. But you know where my security lay? God was my shield. And God was my fortress. Because I learned that security is not the absence of danger, it's the presence of God. God's abiding, presiding, providing presence. I was able to survive 6 years in the most dangerous policing role in the world besides El Salvador because I was protected by that truth. that God is with us in Jesus Christ. He came within history, Emmanuel, and he took that long walk, as we said, to Calvary's Hill, and he diffused death, and he paid for our sin, and he rose again, and he can release us from the bondage of the fear of death, and he can give us the gift of eternal life and the gift of the Holy Spirit to dwell within us. It was that helped me survive. It's that I hope gives me some of my courage, if I have any, and sustains me even to this day. And I commend it to you. Security is not the absence of danger, it's the presence of God. Let me finish with a story. If you want another kind of life to look into beyond the courage of Charlie Kirk, beyond my story in Northern Ireland, what about the life of David Livingstone? I mean, what a man of God. Spent 32 years in the continent of Africa. He evangelized, he explored, he emancipated slaves. His life was marked by hostility and hardship. He lost his wife on the field. He was mauled by a lion. He had all kinds of diseases and dysentery. He faced getting caught in the crossfire of tribal animosities. And yet he survived. And when he came home to Scotland, which was his home, into the city of Glasgow, he was once asked, how you had done it. Here's what he said: would you like me to tell you what supported me through all the years of exile among people whose language I couldn't understand and whose attitude towards me was almost always uncertain and often hostile? It was this. Jesus said in Matthew 28, verse 20, "Lo, I am with you always, even at the end of the world." On those words I staked everything, and they never failed. You see, he believes security is not the absence of danger. Even in the thick of Africa, it's the presence of God. Taking refuge in his sovereignty that God has written down the day of our deaths. Taking refuge in the truth that nothing will separate us from his love. Taking refuge in the promise that the Comforter within will comfort us whatever is happening without. In fact, Livingstone said of Matthew 28, verse 20, "It is the word of a gentleman, of the sacred and strictest honor, and there is an end of it." That's where he put an end to his worry. There's where he put an end to his fear, believing that Jesus Christ would never leave him or forsake him. That's why he said, without Christ, not one step, but with Christ, anywhere. Don't you love it? I hope that some of this has helped you regain your sense of security. I hope you'll let the reality of death, whatever way it comes, be an evangelist, give you a helping hand to live right with an eternal perspective. Don't keep looking at that photograph. Remember to get to the end of the story and be patient as God unfolds his plan. And remember that wherever you are and whatever you're facing, God is with you. Without Christ, not a step. With Christ, anywhere. Amen?